Deputies Church in the city of New York. My name is Eva Warren. I am the chair of the Young Adult Caucus of General Convention. Joining me today, we are so lucky to have President Julia Ayala Harris, President of the House of Deputies, and Secretary Michael Barlowe, the Executive Officer and Secretary of General Convention, both of whom are wealths of knowledge and have deep insight and advice for us, I think, on the issue of church governance. Just so you all know the structure of this conversation, I have some questions that we've all prepared that we'll start our conversation with those, and then we'll move to open questions from the audience. There are index cards circulating. Because this is being live streamed, we do want all the questions to go through a microphone, so those index cards will get collected and passed up to the front, and I will ask the questions on your behalf. Okay, are we ready?
We're ready.
Sounds good. So I'm going to start with a very easy, basic question. This is definitely, you're going to have an answer for this, I hope. To begin with, could each of you tell us a bit more about how you became involved in church governance? President Ayala Harris?
Sure. It's interesting because I haven't really been asked this question, and I had to really think about, well, how did this happen? And how did I get here? And I will say, and these are things that I think a few of you know about me, and you probably identify, is from a really young age, I really loved church, and I really loved being an acolyte at my church growing up, and I would go to the early service even if I wasn't scheduled, and I would keep acolyting all day as the substitute because there were always kids that didn't show up. And it was just such a pleasure. I looked forward to Sundays and being able to be in church. And then as I got older and I got more and more into nonprofit administration and board of directors governance, I loved governance. And so I find myself in this position as an adult, just too old for the Young Adult Caucus.
Even by Episcopal Church standards.
Even by Episcopal Church standards. Just really blessed to be able to be in a governance role in a church. And I think it's a real calling, and it's just thrilling and exciting. And I'm looking around and thinking about who all is in the Young Adult Caucus, and I think there are a lot of people who also have similar stories to that. Yeah.
Secretary Barlowe?
Wow. Well, it is a great question. I don't think I'd ever been asked it before either. The reality is that I became a practicing Christian / Episcopalian and a seminarian almost within the same day. And I became a member of St. Michael's on the Upper West Side here. I was a young banker. I was in my mid-20s, living in New York City and working on Wall Street. And as always happened at that time, and still happens some places, I was asked very shortly thereafter to become a member of the vestry of St. Michael's. And some of you may know that St. Michael's Church on the Upper West Side, 99th in Amsterdam, owns the largest Protestant cemetery in New York City, which if you look out the window, if you fly into LaGuardia and look down, you'll see acres and acres and acres of tombstones. And that's owned by St. Michael's Episcopal Church. And it was the worst job anyone on the vestry could be given to oversee the running of the cemetery, which is what I did. And that propelled me, because I had to, into discussions with the city, which in turn propelled me into discussions with the diocese. And one thing led to the other, and I was eventually ordained and left all that. And my first general convention was when I was had just finished seminary at General Seminary here in New York, and was in 1985 the editor of the now defunct Episcopal Church Journal on Ecumenical Relations, which sounds very exalted, but actually was basically a clippings service, and they needed someone who could type. So that was me, and that took me to my first general convention, and I've been to pretty much all of them since.
We have kind of danced around the issue of General Convention. Both of you are very involved in General Convention, and I know some folks who are attending our workshop this week maybe are a little less familiar with the role of General Convention and the role that it has in the larger church. So could you tell us a little bit more about how General Convention shapes the priorities of the church as a whole? Whichever of you wants to take the lead on that one.
Well, I'll give it a shot, and then I can be corrected. That's always the better thing. I mean, you all know that the General Convention under God is the highest authority in the Episcopal Church. We've had this debate over the centuries about whether we should have archbishops and what the role of bishops are and all that. And it's to the endless confusion of especially our friends in the Church of England, but also elsewhere in the world, as to the representative democracy that basically underpins the governance of the Episcopal Church. And because it's the highest authority under God of the Episcopal Church, the General Convention has a unique role throughout the Anglican world in setting the direction through a variety of means for what God's mission and our cooperation, our understanding of God's mission and our cooperation with God's mission over the coming 3 years and beyond will be. So to me, lots of descriptions have been said about General Convention, including family reunions, which is not my favorite phrase about any of that, but also sort of gatherings of folks beyond deputies and bishops, or the Episcopal Church women and other sort of, quote, official groups. But for me, the most important aspect about it is the spiritual role, and that is a theological understanding, which I think we are a torchbearer for in the church, with a capital C, the church throughout the world, not just the Anglican Church. And that is our belief as an incarnational church, that God has given each of us, whatever our roles in the church are, whether we are lay people, deacons, bishops, or priests, that God speaks through us. And General Convention, through our representative democracy, is the way that we have chosen to inhabit that theological reality and to trust God that God will bless our faithfulness.
I'm so glad you went first, Secretary Barlowe, because I knew it'd be inspirational and with historical context, which is just a gift. Some of the things one of the things that I love the most about General Convention that Secretary Barlowe also just touched on is how it is the highest body in the Episcopal Church. It involves the most people and is in the House of Deputies, equal between clergy and lay, and then it involves bishops as well. So when, I have the tremendous honor, which I'm sure you all, as you begin to talk to your parishes and your dioceses, when you go to explain what General Convention is, where we can say lay people have the ability to have the same voice as others in the church, in all levels of the church, and General Convention being the highest authority with all these lay people, which it's so unique and so empowering, and sometimes I think we take it for granted a little bit. We take vestries for granted in the Episcopal Church sometimes, and we take General Convention for granted, and those are things that I really want us to hold on to and claim, that all orders of the church have seat and voice and vote in the biggest decisions that we make.
And the bishops are the junior house.
They are the junior house, and the House of Deputies are the senior house. We established the House of Bishops on their behalf, which we were kind of chatting about before we started. The other piece that I like about General Convention, we're talking about, is it the big party? Is it a family reunion? That I am thinking about as I start to stare down that countdown clock to General Convention and trying to figure out how I'm gonna, with the GCO, with the General Convention Office help, make all these decisions. But is that General Convention is a bit like Episcopal Comic-Con, right? So, like, it's our big time to all get together and church geek out and get to know each other. And and to make all the big important decisions in the church. And then the other piece that I almost forgot that I did want to say is about in the representational democracy that we have, or representative democracy that we have, is how deputies are not just in representative theory, so I'm going to get a little political, science-y, I apologize in advance. There are different, a delegate is someone who represents their parish, like at a diocesan convention. And a deputy is someone who votes their conscience. And in the House of Deputies, having those almost 900 deputies all sitting there in equal orders voting their conscience, I think has been able to show us over the years what a huge impact that can make on real people's lived lives. So we look at women's ordination, we look at LGBTQ rights, we look at how we see God-given image in each other and express that to the world. And we do that, at least in the House of Deputies, because we vote our conscience. And it's just an amazing spiritual and historical piece that I'm just grateful to be a part of. And I'm excited about the Comic-Con.
Are we dressing up? I know that there are some in the audience who deeply, deeply, deeply want a day on the floor in chapel dress, because if we have earned these academic hoods, we might as well be able to wear them.
That's a really good point. I have my academic hoods at home. I think so it's an interesting piece. This is not one of your actual questions, but I'm going to go ahead with it. For a long time, the president of the House of Deputies wore academic garb. And President Jennings did not. So I've recently been asked, am I gonna wear my academic hood? My hood it's a peacock velour. I love it so much. It's really beautiful. But I realized I already bought 2 of the blazers that I planned to wear on the platform. So I think I'm gonna go blazer.
Perfect.
I think I'm gonna go without the but people, we can do an academic night or an academic day.
We might as well show off all of our regalia.
Right.
The Episcopal Church loves vestments. I mean, we dress to impress.
Right.
I don't know. I'd be more in favor of an anime dress day, personally, but no.
I would love to see you propose that to the House. I would love to see the bishops dressed up for Episcocon.
Some would
Totoro.
say they do that all the time.
I want to be the little tiny Totoro with the big leaf.
Oh, perfect.
Yeah.
I love that. Okay, so now that we have brought forward an issue that needs to be decided, who makes decisions about issues in front of the House? Do you do it in all of your authority as president? You just go boom, boom with a gavel?
Oh, I see. I thought that was about like who votes and how.
Yeah, you can. I mean, it can be however we can do
Oh,
that.
interesting.
Who decides what comes before the House? Who decides how it's responded? What are some of the kind of like background pieces of the legislative process?
Okay, I'll take a stab at this, and then Secretary Barlowe can correct me, because this will be my first time. Really, so there is the House of Deputies, and there are people who are appointed onto legislative committees. And we have 24 legislative committees at this coming General Convention. And it's those legislative committees that work through and process all of the resolutions that come to General Convention. And the legislative committees work with the chair of dispatch to decide, well, what will come to the floor and what will be on the consent calendar. And so really what that means is it's deputies who are participating in the agenda setting of what hits the floor at the House of Deputies. So in a very democratic, participatory kind of a way. There are some like special orders of business for big topics, but I don't know if you want to get into that, Secretary Barlowe?
I think that is absolutely accurate, and the only thing I would add is sort of the background to all of that, and this is something that I've pondered a lot over the last few years, and it's this, that we have a tendency in the Episcopal Church, maybe it's a tendency in the contemporary world, to be reactionary rather than to be more proleptic, thinking toward the future. So I've seen an increasing movement over the years toward that reactivity, and by that I don't mean I don't mean it to be in a pejorative sense in describing it as that, but in the sense that we react to resolutions rather than being more intentional about looking to the future. Now there have been, most recently, and a group that was just meeting. President Ayala Harris and I had dinner last night with the folks who are organizing the Coalition for Racial Reconciliation and Justice that was approved at the last General Convention. So that's an example, counterexample to what I'm saying. But I think that in this growing world where we have the illusion where individuals have at their virtual fingertips all the information we individualistically need to have to be able to make autonomous decisions, even though none of us ever think about it that way. And we all know that everything is either massaged or messaged in a particular way, so that the question about what is truth is not just what Pilate asked. I think one of the questions for General Convention is whether the post-World War II, 1950s and beyond, which we've continued doing, reliance on resolutions, which are by their very nature reactive. The two houses react to resolutions. Whether that is the best way to discern God's mission for this part of the 21st century. And I can say more about that at another time.
But quite the challenge for us.
It would mean a cultural shift, because we've been in a track, and fundamentally resolutions are transactional, as you all know. Committees decide on something, they tweak things, there's debate, it's just adopted, not adopted, and so forth. It's transactional. But a larger discernment about what we're all about as a church, we haven't always done it that way, you know, it's not always been that way. And I guess the real question I'm asking is whether the way that we make decisions, not the structures, but the way that we react to things through our structures, which was fundamentally created in the post-World War II era, if that really still is serving us.
This is a lovely segue. You've said that we do make decisions about issues. How do we make decisions? Who makes the decisions?
Well, that's really sort of my point, is that I'm not sure we make decisions. We react to other people's decisions. And I think there is an illusion that we make decisions. Now, certainly canonically and constitutionally, we make decisions. So, for instance, the long years, which many of us were deeply involved with, for the full inclusion of LGBTQ folks into the church. I mean, the first time I was ever at General Convention as a deputy, it was the third time that any issue, and I'm a partnered gay man, it was the first, and have been for 40 plus years, it was the first time that I had sat in a legislative body where decisions that had been made about me and my partner and about things I cared about were decided by General Convention. And the decision was, you're not really part of the church. So is that a decision, or is it something else? Is it a reaction to? Now, I've given one example already about decisions that I think really, that are truly decisions. And I'm being sort of theological here, but to me, a decision by the church needs to be consonant with God's purposes. So we make a lot of decisions that look like decisions, but whether they're God's decisions, I'm less convinced about sometimes. The good news is that over the course, you know, as we famously quote, the arc of history is toward justice and God's justice.
Yeah, that's a really interesting sort of angle to go at who makes decisions, right? And how do we make decisions? So I'm going to kind of play off some other things that you mentioned, Secretary Barlowe, which is about the transactional nature of resolutions. And I think a lot of times what we see, the vast majority of what we see at General Convention are resolutions that sort of tinker a little bit with where we're at, kind of like a thermostat, right? So it's like my hotel room was a little too warm last night. So, you know, I'm like trying to make it slightly colder, and I'm using an old school thermostat probably, or like on your phone, I have no idea. But I have a really old house, so we have an old thermostat. And so, you tinker, you go a little bit to the left, you go a little bit to the right until you find what feels right at the moment. And I think the vast majority of resolutions are in that thermostatic model where we're just tinkering. We're saying, okay, this is a little, a little too liberal or a little too conservative, because we bring in some of those ideas that we get from the secular world, right? And into General Convention, which I don't think is necessarily helpful. But that's what we're used to. We live and breathe, in particular in American politics, this sort of like, and in particular nowadays, a conservative sort of liberal binary that's a false binary. And so I can see us doing that thermostatic model to try to, find out, well, where do we feel right now as Episcopalians is the right temperature for us? However, while that's the vast majority of, I think, the decisions that we make at General Convention, the House of Deputies and the House of Bishops, the thing that I think that we all get excited about, and you all particularly in this room, is a completely different model. It's more of a social movements model, right? So at this last General Convention, we witnessed indigenous folks who, and actual survivors of indigenous boarding schools taking the microphone and telling their stories. And President Jennings allowed for the full 20 minutes for that, because that was a social movement, right? That was the Holy Spirit working. That was discernment of the church of, this is something that we have not grappled with yet. We have not figured out how to do this. We are feeling the Spirit among us, and we're going to go in this direction. And that is not transactional. That is not the thermostatic model. That is not trying to feel out, where are we in the Episcopal Church right now? That's the Holy Spirit. And so what I would love to see is for us to be able to have more of those type of moments, those types of conversations, the Spirit moving and telling us, hey, this is where we want the Episcopal Church to be at right now, versus it's a little too hot, a little too cold, which is the majority of what we do. Mm-hmm.
So we've spoken a little bit about perhaps some of the challenges of our governance system as it is, thermostat tinkering included. Could you speak to some of the strengths of our governance system? What are some of the things that stand out to you as being beneficial or exciting or good about our very hierarchical nature?
In this 1 hour that we have?
I'm going to limit you to the next 5 minutes even.
Okay. I'll jump in. So one of the things that I do love, that goes back to deputies voting their conscience and not being necessarily a representative of a particular group of people or their diocese, is how open and participatory our system is. So in the House of Deputies, for example, and you guys already know this or are going to learn this, every single resolution that comes to General Convention gets a hearing, every single one. And anyone, deputy, non-deputy, Episcopalian, non-Episcopalian, can come in and testify to that resolution in open meetings, whether over Zoom or in person. And I can't think of anything more exciting than that. I'm gonna be totally honest, and I realize like I'm just geeking out over here, but what other body has something like that? And what other church has something like that, where anyone can come in and give testimony on all of the matters that will face the highest body of our organization, of our church? It's just, to me, very exciting, in addition to, again, the equality between lay and ordained in the House of Deputies and a whole bunch of other things. But it seems like something so small. In the House of Deputies, every resolution gets a hearing and anyone can testify at a hearing. But I think that's indicative of how open our church can be and things that we might look over and just take for granted.
Well, I would certainly agree with that. I think that the participatory nature of our governance, and especially General Convention, is one of the treasures of the Episcopal Church. And I'd also say, though, and this to the point of what's good about all this, is that in the current state of the world, it's very countercultural to try to include voices rather than becoming authoritarian. And we have those tendencies in the Episcopal Church. The authoritarian spirit of the age is alive within the Episcopal Church, where people want to get rid of some of this participation because it's expensive and it takes a lot of people and it takes a lot of time, and just let this category of the leaders make all the decisions. The counter-cultural aspect of our polity, of our governance, and our history, I think, is exactly what our world and certainly our church needs right now.
We had some conversation this morning about the thrilling topic of the budget. This being a gathering of church geeks and budding church geeks. Could you tell us a little bit more about how the budget gets decided, why we should maybe care about the budget, and perhaps what our role is in deciding the budget?
Yes, thank you, Eva. Should I go first and then you can?
Sure.
Okay, because I'm pretty excited about this. So we have a major, and I'm curious to know, and I'll find out later what you all talked about this morning, but we have a major change in how we're doing our budget. And this is the first time we're doing it this way. And I'm trying to talk to as many people as possible to get the word out, which is this. So in the past, if you've been a deputy or an alternate or just a church geek watching at home, which I did for many, many general conventions, we used to have a legislative committee called Program, Budget, and Finance, and we don't have that anymore. So what we have now is an executive council committee called the Joint Budget Committee. And the way that, and I'll skip a whole bunch of details, but to give you the big, to not bury the lead, which is the period for being able to learn more about the budget and then turn around and give input to the Joint Budget Committee is right now. So they have, the Joint Budget Committee has presented a working draft, basically, to Executive Council, and they're doing a series of listening sessions, and they have a website on the General Convention office page that you can find, and you can submit in writing your ideas, requests, feedback, reflections on the budget. And you can also go to these listening sessions and talk to members of the Joint Budget Committee about what you think the priorities of the budget should be from now until mid-January, when the Joint Budget Committee then will present a proposed budget to Executive Council. After January, that budget is locked. And they'll still do listening, and they'll still be engaged in talking to deputies and bishops about what might be able to change in the budget, but they cannot actually tinker with the budget during that time. And then it'll come to General Convention, and then one of the beauties of the Joint Budget Committee is that they will meet after General Convention to then reflect on what were the priorities at this General Convention that need to be reflected in the budget, which we have not done before. The Program, Budget, and Finance did not meet after General Convention to reconcile the priorities of General Convention with the budget. So that's one of the big, great takeaways of the Joint Budget Committee. One of the things that I want to make sure everyone who's willing to listen to me knows is that now is the period to have any impact, influence, or to be able to talk to the Joint Budget Committee to make changes to the current budget.
And this is a great time to make a plug for your source of all things General Convention and governance in the Episcopal Church, and that's to go to www.generalconvention.org, where you'll find all of the sites that have been mentioned, and particularly about the listening sessions about the budget and the budget as it stands right now. One of the other background pieces which has been identified by the Joint Budget Committee, which both the President and I sit on ex officio, is that we have not yet tackled the larger question. This goes back to my comment about reactivity. We haven't started answering the larger question for the church to answer the following. What is the purpose of the church-wide organization and the funding that is required to do that? It seems like a sort of a basic question for me. I've never been in any organization that didn't start with that question in the past. And I think it's not because we've been we've been dilettantes about it. I think it's because we just haven't done that recently, and I think there's been a lot of shifting, especially as some dioceses have become financially stressed, and there's been a huge desire in some quarters of the church to reduce the amount of money that's sent to the central body of the Episcopal Church. without asking the question, well, these were this is what we said the central church bodies would do in the past. Does that pertain anymore? So I hope that as we live into this new model of doing budgeting, that will be on the agenda for our next full triennium for some time, because I think if we don't answer that question, at least, and I think we should constantly answer that question, then we will be frustrated by a lack of resources that I actually think is not true. I think we've got all the resources for everything that God is calling us to do, financial and otherwise, but I wonder whether we have yet asked the questions in such a way that we can faithfully answer those questions.
And I will just add a small plug for those of you who are on our email newsletter list. We will put information about signing up to testify or to attend any of these listening sessions. All of that will be hitting your inboxes as a kind of centralized list of the things that we've discussed. So not everyone who is attending is a deputy. Some folks are doing this for the first time and kind of dipping their toes in church legislative waters. Could you share a little bit of information or advice or guidance on the role that everyday Episcopalians might play in the governance of the church?
I'll start, if you'd like.
Okay.
Well, I mean, you're doing the right thing by being here and adding your voices to the discussion. And if you are deputies to the convention, I hope you're listening as well as even though, as the president just said earlier today, you are indeed deputies, not delegates. But I hope and believe that you'll be listening deeply to other folks. I think that the passions that we have in our local ministry have a direct connection with what God is doing in the larger tapestry. So if I were you, one of the ways that I would try to, wherever you are and how ordinary Episcopalians might participate, would be to be constantly thinking about that tapestry, what I'm involved with as an individual, what my parish or community is involved with, what my diocese and so forth is involved with, how that fits into the larger tapestry. And if you're not a deputy, speak to those who have a voting voice, because, as we've said here several times, in a representative democracy, they still represent the ideas, not just the individual ideas, but the collective ideas of the church and its members.
Yeah, I would also add, when it comes to General Convention, and if you're going to be at General Convention, you're not a deputy or an alternate deputy, you're actually in a really amazing space. Because my experience in my first in-person General Convention, I was a part of the Young Adult Festival. And so I got to, run around and do all the fun things behind the scenes. And when deputies were in session, I was able to walk around the exhibition hall and meet other non-deputies. And then the other fun piece was that at night when the deputies would come out, it was really interesting because they cared about what young folks like us in the Young Adult Festival and some of the official youth presidents really were thinking. Because they understood, you are the future of the church or a future deputy, and where is our church going, and wanted to be able to reflect that in how they voted. So your influence, right, is going to be huge at General Convention, even if you're not a deputy or an alternate deputy. And then when you bring it home, oh my gosh, I can't tell you how many times, I'm going to get in so much trouble now, I came back after General Convention in 2018, and one of our middle schoolers started a movement to have, in Oklahoma, in my home diocese, to have the gender-neutral Eucharist, right? So enriching our worship. And what was interesting is my parish priest, who was a former deputy, did not know that General Convention authorized enriching our worship regardless. You didn't need to get authorization from your local bishop to be able to do that. And so I, was on vestry and just perked up and said, General Convention, we're allowed to just do this. And so sometimes you can be like that good trouble instigating force in your local parish, right? I have all sorts of empathy for rectors, but as a layperson, sometimes we can be a little annoying, but isn't that like what we're called to be when the Spirit moves us in church? And I completely agree with what Secretary Barlowe said, like where you do your local mission and ministry is also reflected in a lot of the resolutions in General Convention. You can take those with you, like being able to say, there aren't hurdles anymore to having a gender-neutral service, even in the middle of the country.
Even in the middle of the country.
If I could do a follow-up about just practical things. For those of you who are not deputies who are going to be at General Convention in Louisville, my own experience, and I was in that position, as you heard earlier in my presentations here today, it can be overwhelming of the amount of information and things going on and so forth. A very wise person, suggested to me when I was in that position that I decide before I go the kinds of things, issues, resolutions, meetings, events that I really was passionate about, and to create my own agenda for the interacting with General Convention. And that served me well, and I think it served a lot of people well, and I would encourage you to consider that.
Perfect. Well, I have finished the list of questions that I had, but I see Elizabeth approaching with hopefully some questions from the lovely, oh my goodness, a whole stack. I should never have doubted you all. Okay. This is from Sarah Woodford from the Diocese of Connecticut. Thank you, Sarah. If you were explaining General Convention to a parishioner or someone who is not Episcopalian, what would you want them to know?
Well, I'd like them to know that almost everything that we value today in 2023 about the Episcopal Church was approved or came from the General Convention of the Episcopal Church. All of the issues of inclusion that we have dealt with over the last, centuries really, and are continuing to struggle with, that it is General Convention that made it possible for women to be fully integrated into the governance and the ministries of the church, for instance. It is the General Convention that finally made the decision to recognize and bless God-given relationships between people of the same gender. It is General Convention that first raised issues involving the need for reconciliation in our churches and to really combat at every level. So it's not alien from what happens in our individual parishes. It is intrinsic to what the experience is in our local parishes and congregations and communities.
Yeah, that's the big one. I think the other piece I would add to it is that the General Convention that helps shape these things is not a closed-door meeting of a few people, right?
Certainly not a few.
Not a few. and going back to that, it's not just bishops making these decisions, but it is clergy and lay people who are discerning this together, and that's the common discernment piece.
I don't know who wrote this, so apologies for not giving you credit where credit is due. This question reads, as someone who works deeply in Indigenous communities, I would love to hear of the progress in the boarding school study and ways we can support and raise awareness of it.
Yeah, I'll jump in. I was just with the commission and the committee. They were both meeting last week. So last General Convention, A127 created an Indigenous Boarding School Fact-Finding Commission that has no end date. And those folks met in conjunction with the Executive Council. They have slightly different names. Executive Council Committee on Native American Boarding Schools and Advocacy. And they have really similar mandates. They're both looking into our history with Indigenous boarding schools. They're both looking at how we can partner with the State Department on their looking into the boarding school history in the country, in the United States. And then they're both doing some advocacy. And those groups met last week. What is really inspirational, well, almost everything about that meeting was inspirational. But one of the big takeaways that's so different from what I've seen thus far in the church is when we've had money, huge sums of money and funds coming forward for an issue out of General Convention, like we did for racial reconciliation back in 2015, the system, the church then has to figure out, well, what to do with it. Oh my gosh, now we have, these $2 million, and what kind of programs do we want to offer, and what do we want the vision to be, and it takes a long time. These folks just got together, and for the first time in person, they've been meeting online, and it was the complete opposite. So here we have people who are boarding school survivors in the room, people who had aunts or uncles or parents or grandparents that went to boarding schools, and they already knew because what they wanted to do. They were ready with a vision and a strategy because they've been waiting for the Episcopal Church to wake up. Mm-hmm. So it's the opposite, right? Instead of, this is a felt need that we have and we want to start devoting something to it and we think it's going to look like this. With the Indigenous boarding schools, they've already known and they've been waiting. And so now the church has finally come to them. I would say to keep a lookout. I'm a little cautious about how to support their strategy or anything because to me, I think it's important that it's Indigenous led. And so I'm following and participating with them in any manner that they ask of me. But there are co-chairs that are going to start to have a more public presence and communication soon to explain to everyone where they're at and what they're thinking. So look for that.
Many of you will know that the archival research that has to be done on this is mammoth. And one of the things that the Archives of the Episcopal Church has already ascertained is that we don't have very many records because in the 19th century especially, but really all the way through the 20th century, most of the work that was done in indigenous communities was not done by the church-wide organization, but by independent missionary societies or ad hoc groups or whatever, and dioceses. So one of the things that I would encourage each of you, wherever you're from, whatever diocese you're in, is to encourage your local archivists and church historians in your context to begin doing some of that work, because it's going to, we need, if we're going to tell the whole truth, we're going to need to look at some of those, literally look at some of those dusty boxes that no one's looked at in 100 years.
President Ayala Harris, you mentioned attending the Young Adult Festival. What is the Young Adult Festival, and is it going to make a comeback?
It has changed a lot over the past few general conventions. It's put on by the formation department, so I don't know if it's coming back or not.
What is it? Let's start. I guess let's start there.
So the Young Adult Festival was also a part of YServe, which has now been separated out from General Convention, which was YServe was for people of color discerning vocation in the church, whether that was ordained or non-ordained. And the Young Adult Festival now is essentially, it's about maybe like 30 people or so who are not deputies, not alternates, and have great interest in General Convention. And the formation department puts out like an application process that you can apply. And it's for anyone between the ages, I believe, of 18 and 30-ish. So perfect for this audience, but I'm not sure where formation department's at with that.
So keep an eye out.
Yes.
And play it by ear.
Yes. The biennium has messed up some of our timetables.
I will also briefly steal the soapbox, if I may. There are lots of opportunities for folks to attend General Convention in non-voting roles, either as part of the official youth presence or the Young Adult Festival. But if you are eligible for either of those bodies, you are also eligible to be a deputy.
Right.
And I would encourage folks who are maybe considering those options to also consider running to be a deputy or alternate, because then you get voice and vote, and that is another way to get involved. Okay. Resolutions can sometimes feel very final when they are reactionary, shall we say. How do we hold space for opposition to resolutions that have passed?
Sometimes it seems like we've spent more time trying to deal with placating the hurt feelings of people that lost when it was something that I cared about than we do about allowing the church to actually move into what the decisions that we made actually intended. An example of this is, for instance, it continues to bother me that throughout some 40 years of attending general conventions, we have never been allowed by any of our presiding officers to applaud when an issue of justice has finally prevailed. So I just want to get that out there first.
We'll pass the soapbox right along.
And most recently,
No
it was when we decided that, and I was sitting on the platform when we decided to allow for the marriage of same-sex couples in the Episcopal Church, and no applause. So it's not, and it was because of a desire. It's a good desire. I mean, it was a good impulse. It was a desire to keep us all at the table. I know that's not what the question was asking, but I wanted to say that. I think that the broader answer is don't give up. That's the thing. I mean, to continue to use the illustration of the inclusion of LGBTQ folks in any part of the church, including the ability to serve on a vestry, from the time that pioneers like Louis Crew first raised these issues and was laughed out of Grace Cathedral in San Francisco, and then couldn't get a return phone call from the Bishop of Georgia, to where we are now is a story that is littered with no, the church won't do that. No, we can't. And people like Louis and others, and in a small way, many of us, and in larger ways, we just kept coming back to the table. We didn't take no for an answer. So if I had one piece of advice about minority voices or non-prevailing voices in the resolutions that the church does pass, I would say, if it is of the Spirit, it will prevail eventually. So do not give up. Be of good heart.
Mine is going to be similar. That long arc of justice, right, is that not every general convention will, and nor should it, give us all that we think the church needs to be doing in that moment, right? Because we all have our own biases and our own lived experiences and everything else that we bring to general convention and to the church. But to not lose heart in that, come back again next time, and we will, iteration by iteration, be able to get to these places where we need to be. And sometimes it can be, this is going to sound, I'm going to feel so old saying this, but if that sense of when you're able to come to some sort of agreement with someone who's so very different from you, and you can have that okay, we can meet at this common table, and we've been able to move just a little bit closer to where I believe the Holy Spirit's calling us to be, but I'm also able to do it with someone who has a very different worldview than I do and calls themselves Episcopalian at the same time. There's something so holy in that. And that's part of the struggle at General Convention sometimes, right? Is I don't think we're exactly where we need to be yet. And my colleague, at the next deputation table also doesn't think that their church is where we should be at right now, but we agree on the space that we're currently going in. It's a struggle, but doing holy things is sometimes hard and difficult and a struggle.
With apologies to those whose questions I could not get to, for the last question of today's panel from Audrey in Ohio, well, in New York from Ohio, I should say. How does General Convention go about ensuring diversity in both the members of the body and diversity in thought in decision making?
It's a great question.
It's a hard question too, because the word ensure is in there. And deputies are elected from their diocese, right? So General Convention can't necessarily itself ensure, because deputies are elected from their home areas. And so they're a lot of times a reflection of their diocese. However, what we can do, and Secretary Barlowe and I are pretty passionate about this, is to reduce some of the barriers. So I have these 3 priorities for my presidency: accessibility, inclusivity, and safety. And what our 2 offices are trying to do are reduce the barriers for participation. And so that is deputies and non-deputies. And that's looking at, well, what are ways that we can use modern technology like Zoom and live streaming to be able to allow folks to come to hearings without having to take 2 weeks off from their jobs and travel someplace and pay for a hotel, so that they can have their voice heard at General Convention. So we're trying to find more and more ways that we can actually make our governance structures more accessible to more people, so we can have more voices that come in. And I think that's the closest thing that I can think of to the word ensure. Since deputies are, again, elected from their diocese, there's no, it's not like, well, the president gets to pick 1 deputy for each deputation, and then I can ensure a broad diversity of voices.
May I
Ensure.
nudge you down the path of interim bodies?
Oh, so for interim bodies, for example, and then this is something, and it goes along with making things more accessible at General Convention, is one of the things that I took really seriously was making appointments. One of the things that the president does is makes a ton of appointments. And so I took really seriously making appointments to interim bodies for that reflected people who are not usually heard from within the church, either by virtue of their identity, where they live, their age, their language, so non-English speakers. Another piece that is sort of rolling into is for legislative committees. So one of the ways that the special committee, the House of Deputies Special Committee on Rules of Order, one of the big grand problems that we were working with was how can, for example, when it comes to appointments, how can I appoint as many non-English speakers to as many, if not all, of the legislative committees as possible without having the General Convention office have to pay $15 million in simultaneous interpreters for each one of these. And one of the ways that the special committee, one of the solutions was, well, we will have legislative committees meet over Zoom at different times, so that way we can send our interpreters, and they don't all have to be, if we're meeting ahead of time over Zoom, then we don't have to have 2 interpreters for each legislative committee, all in person, all at the same time, all in Louisville. And so it's a realistic cost-saving measure, but allows for more people who otherwise would not be able to be appointed to a legislative committee to be able to be appointed to a legislative committee. So we're still working on that. Special committee is still discerning and looking at rules of order. Some of you may have seen it. I know a few of you testified, and we're going to have a workshop coming up in mid-November on another proposed draft of rules of order. So I'm still trying to find ways to be able to appoint people to those legislative committees that are people that we don't that are coming from traditionally marginalized communities, or people that the Episcopal Church doesn't typically hear from, but being able to do it within the confines of what we can actually pull off.
And to the second piece of that about diversity of thought and opinion, one of the things that my friend and colleague Byron Rushing, who is the recently retired vice president of the House of Deputies, revived in the Episcopal Church was the ancient, in Episcopal terms, custom of having memorials, which are not resolutions, but are usually larger thought pieces and don't have to be produced by deputies or bishops. So one of the things, if you have bigger issues that are more complex or that demand by their very nature, a multitude of general conventions to really get before, you might want to think about creating a memorial to General Convention as a way of getting some of the diverse and, dare I say, futuristic, proleptic ideas beyond the reactionary in front of General Convention. And they will be appropriately looked at by the representative democracy that is General Convention.
Wonderful. We are at time, on time. Please join me in thanking our two panelists. It's been such a joy to learn from you and to speak with you, and I am so excited to see the good work that we all can continue to do together.
Thank you. Thank you.
Can I make one last comment?
Go for it.
I love that we did this in the sanctuary, because governance is a ministry and it's holy and sacred work, and so many times we don't have these conversations in a sanctuary. So thank you for setting us up here.
I thank St. Bart's for that stroke of Holy Spirit-infused insight. Logistically, we're going to head back upstairs for lunch, and you can follow Elizabeth and other members of the steering committee, and we will get you all upstairs to have a good lunch and continued conversation. Thank you all again.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.